I know I'd rather me mate cry on my shoulder than go to his funeral next week. So please, let's get rid of this stigma and men start talking.
Hey, what's up guys? It's Nick here with another breakdown. And as you see from the previous clip, that was UFC rising star Paddy the Baddy Pimblett, who was speaking on a topic that is kind of hard to talk about. And that's the irony, because it needs to be talked about more. It's a very touchy subject, but the male suicide rate has been on the increase. Now, this is not to disregard suicide as a whole, as it's a tragedy regardless of who it happens to. But the issue at hand with the male suicide rate, it's growing and growing, and we need to talk about it more. And the fact that even more higher stats people are mentioning it is a good start. But let's get into the breakdown of why this may be occurring. And if you may be able to help someone near and dear to you, then we can all take something from this. So with that being said, let's get into it and break it down.
One of my friends back home had killed himself. If you're a man and you've got weight on your shoulders and you think the only way you can solve it is by killing yourself, please speak to someone. Speak to anyone. Let's get rid of this stigma and men start talking.
Now, as you saw, Paddy was doing an interview in the Octagon right after a victory, and he took that moment center stage to talk about his friend who he had found out only 5 hours before his fight, which is a whole nother topic in itself, how he held that together. But he found out that they had passed due to taking their own life. Now, this was a heartfelt moment, and you could see that he really was shaken up by this, and anyone would. Now, the narrative in itself is getting talked about a lot more in media. Now, that's great, and I'm a big proponent that this needs to be talked about, but I also think that needs to be discussed beyond just celebrities and stars and the bigger media outlets, and it should be talked about more amongst the everyday people, because sometimes when it's put on center stage, it can take the world by storm and people care, and it kind of dies down. It doesn't mean that's not needed. We do need the bigger names talking about it since their reach is so far, but to understand and change the narrative, we need to educate ourselves so we could all do better about understanding mental health as a whole. A lot of times mental health is seen as something that's just in your head. Obviously it starts with the brain, but sometimes it's disregarded, because if you saw someone suffering from a physical ailment, a sickness, a disease, you would tell them, we hope you get better, or if they break a bone, you want to sign their cast. But if it's mental health, sometimes people go about it as, well, just get over it. And they may not even mean any harm by it. But when you come to someone who's going through a tough time and they hear that someone they care about and confide and trust doesn't seem to be that interested, they might turn them away. And unfortunately, that does lead to more dire consequences. Now, this is not to say that everyone should be coddled, but you have to understand what they may be going through. And this goes back to the education that mental health, while it is in your head, there's life situations, circumstances, socioeconomic circumstances. You know, a lot of times when people get depressed or anxious, it's a product of their environment sometimes. And it may not be as easy as just rolling off your shoulder or letting it go. And on the other side of that, you need to understand what you're even looking for. A lot of times when a person loses someone to suicide, they ask some of the same questions. I wish I would have known, or I wish they would have talked to me. And like Paddy said, I'd rather you come talk to me than be at your funeral. But the thing is, sometimes we don't even notice it, because a lot of times in media and pop culture, depression or anxiety or all these different mental health issues are depicted in a haphazardly way. Sometimes it's funny, laughable, or sometimes it's so dark and gloomy that you think it's either extreme on one side or the other. But a lot of times, mental health issues are based off of subtle things. Even if you look at the DSM-5, which is the clinical diagnosis manual for mental disorders, something like depression, there's numerous criteria that they could meet, and there's others that they might not meet, but they might still be going through it. Now, while suicide is a touchy topic, there's some things you might want to understand about it that help you even notice the things such as ideation, because ideation means having thoughts. Sometimes people have thoughts because life gets hard, they get down, they think, what if I wasn't here? I believe most people have had that thought once or twice in their life. And that's not a bad thing, because it gives us this reason to reevaluate where we're at in life and overcome it. But sometimes people get stuck in the ideation and they don't overcome, and it gets stronger. Something called rumination is when we have these deep depressive thoughts that tell us, hey, it's bad. And we keep reminding ourselves every moment of every day that it's bad. And we ruminate on these thoughts. It builds actual neuron pathways that get stronger. So our default mode in our brain is to be depressed. So that's the physical side of it. But ideation doesn't stop there, because sometimes you get into the preparation stage. So when you're in that phase, now you're planning out what are you going to say, what are you going to do, how you're going to do it, who you're going to tell, if you're going to even write a note. this is not the best place to be in. And if a person gets here, it's getting closer to the breaking point where there's no return. And obviously the last stage is when they actually take the action itself and there's no looking back. And a lot of times people want to be heard, but they just don't think that there's a point. So they get to the point where they say, I don't want to be here anymore. No one else cares. No one wants me to be here. And this could probably be furthest from the truth. But sometimes people just don't see it. This is why noticing the signs is important. And also people stigmatize when they express their ideation. They say, oh, that's selfish. You might take it as such as a family member or a friend or a close loved one. But think about this. For someone to be to the point where they don't want to exist anymore, that's not necessarily selfishness. That act takes a lot of commitment and something that you can't undo. So instead of thinking they're being selfish or messed up, what about their friends? You're once again taking away from their well-being. Because sometimes, yes, you might think that, but for the moment, you got to understand what they need to hear so you can understand what they're going through and not push them even further and try to get them the help that they need. Because more than likely, they'll be more accepting to it if they know they have people to support them. Depression as a whole, we have to understand happens to everyone. But the name of the game is intensity, duration, frequency, and severity. This is what changes. Because if you're having a bad day, week, or even month, and you're really going through it and there's a lot of negative things occurring in your life, there's no problem if you feel down. But sometimes this goes longer and it hits way harder, that it changes your social interactions to the point you don't do your normal activities, even hygienic practices, going to work on time. There's so many different ways to look at this. One thing I say to people is notice things that they like to do and how frequently they do them compared to how they're doing them now. I use the example of, say, a guy named John who has a big pleasure in fishing, but he hasn't gone fishing in over 8 months. You say, hey, John, when the last time you've been fishing? He's like, I don't know, about 8 months ago. And you know he goes every weekend and he has a great time. He posts on social media. Now, this is not to say because he's not fishing, he's depressed, because he could just be busy. But these are things you can look at because these subtle habits aren't very noticeable on the forefront, but these are things to take into consideration because some of the biggest aspects of dealing with deep, dark depression is changes in your daily routines to a severe amount that you're not doing them or impairing them to the point you can't do them as efficiently. Yeah, you might still go to work, but are they present? Because there's absenteeism when you're not at work. And there's presenteeism when you're at work, but you're not effective. Yeah, you might get the paperwork done, but what is their mannerism? What are their habits looking like to get to that end point? And these are all things we can notice, but you got to know what you're looking for. Ask them about different health habits. Or the last time you ate? Because sometimes when people are depressed, they don't want to eat, or vice versa, they eat too much. So these are all aspects of an actual clinical disorder. Now, one part that we might really need to take into consideration that isn't necessarily clinical or just mental health is the treatment of men as a whole. There's all types of spaces online on YouTube, like the Manosphere, the Red Pill, that talk about men's well-being and health. And some might think some of it is more extreme, but on the lesser end of things, we got to think about men are people too. There's a lot of jokes at the expense of men. So if you look at the stats, men are 3 to 5 more times likely to commit suicide successfully. So if you average that out, that's a 4-to-1 ratio for men to women. So for every 1 woman, 4 men have committed suicide. Women are more likely to have ideation, but men are way more successful at executing the task. This may be assumed because a lot of times men use more violent means such as hanging, jumping in front of vehicles, off of buildings, or even using guns to inflict a fatal wound. But regardless of why, these numbers add up. On average, about 130 people die from suicide a day. So annually, that's roughly 32,120 men. I know personally 3 people that I have lost due to suicide, and I know what some of the things they were going through, and I wish even then I had known better. But the thing is, when men are put in this position of they always have to be stoic, always have to be the protectors, not to say that this is a good or a bad thing, but sometimes just saying, hey, good job, is all it takes. You'd be surprised how many people do not hear this. How many men go day in, day out, working hard for their friends, family, their coworkers, whatever it may be. They're never told that their value is even worth it, let alone extends beyond said job. So these are just some of the things. There's a lot of negative perceptions due to the dating market that all men are dogs. Honestly, if you really look at the greater scheme of things, it's impossible for all men to be dogs because at least 50% of people are married. But the thing is, we just look at the outliers, the extreme cases, the cheaters, the playboys, and this is put on a lot of men who would never do that. And imagine waking up every day and automatically you're seen as a predator, seen as someone who's gonna take advantage or use or abuse a woman just because of your gender. So that alone could take away some of the problems and could end the stigma, because if a man wants to open up, he knows he's not going to be ridiculed, or he knows he's not going to be looked at in a weaker state. Now, this topic is very touchy, and that's why we got to take it seriously and not make light of it. And I'm glad that Paddy spoke up on it. So if you are going through some troubling times, don't be afraid to open up to someone. And even if you need to get clinical help, reach out. There's numerous services, there's numerous apps if you can't afford the traditional therapy, as well as there's hotlines if you really feel it's getting past ideation, or even if it is at ideation, you can call the hotline. They changed their number to make it more simple, 988. So make sure if that's where you're at, call that number, 988. It's never too late to get help, and you can always get through it. Thanks, as always, for letting me break it down and get your mind right.